Montana Territory, 1870. The empty plains of Montana seemed to stretch forever, meeting the hard blue sky at a horizon that promised nothing but more loneliness. At least that's how Kirby Holcomb saw it as he rode the fence line of his modest cattle ranch. At 25 years old, he'd already convinced himself that the frontier was no place for sentiment, only survival. The harsh winters, relentless work, and constant vigilance against rustlers and predators had taught him that a man alone fared better in this unforgiving country. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Kirby surveyed his land, 300 acres of decent grazing, a small but sturdy cabin, a corral, and a barn. Not much compared to some spreads, but it was his, bought with 4 years of backbreaking work as a trail hand and every penny he'd saved. He'd built it all himself, needed no one, and that was how he preferred it. The only sounds that greeted him at day's end were the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. No room for complications, he muttered to his sorrel gelding as they crested the hill overlooking his cabin. Just you and me and the herd, that's enough. But sometimes, in the dead of winter nights when the wind howled like lost souls around his cabin, or during endless days riding alone under the vast Montana sky, a hollowness opened inside him that no amount of work could fill. Not that he'd admit it even to himself. Kirby dismounted at his cabin, his lean, muscular frame moving with the easy grace of a man accustomed to physical labor. His features were youthful but weathered from sun and wind, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw with just a day's worth of stubble, and eyes the color of the sky in winter. He'd been told by ladies in town that he was handsome, but such compliments meant little on a ranch where cattle didn't care what you looked like. As he unsaddled his horse, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him straighten, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Visitors were rare this far out and rarely brought good news. Sheriff Wyatt Daniels came into view, his badge catching the setting sun as he rode up to the corral. "Evening, Kirby," the sheriff called, dismounting with a grunt that betrayed his 50-some years. "Sheriff," Kirby acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you out this way?" The older man removed his hat, revealing a balding head ringed with gray hair. "Got a situation in town I'm hoping you might help with." Kirby continued his work, slipping the bridle off his horse. "What kind of situation would need my help?" "It's about a young woman," the sheriff said, following Kirby into the barn. "Name's Tabitha Turner. She's 20 years old, arrived on yesterday's stage from Kansas City. Running from trouble, I reckon, though she won't say much, just that she needs somewhere safe to stay." Kirby set down his saddle with more force than necessary. "And you thought of me because you've got space out here, and you're far enough from town that nobody would think to look here." "She's running from the law," Kirby's voice sharpened. "No," Sheriff Daniels shook his head firmly. "Nothing like that. I believe she's running from a man, probably a husband or intended, who's got mean hands. She's got fading bruises she tries to hide." Kirby turned away, busying himself with hanging up his tack. "That's unfortunate, but I don't see how it's my concern. She needs a safe place, Kirby, just for a while. Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house would take her, but there's too many travelers through there. Too easy for someone to find her." "I'm not running a refuge for wayward females, Sheriff. I've got a ranch to manage." The sheriff sighed. "She's willing to work, says she can cook, clean, and sew. Would save you having to do all that yourself." "I manage just fine." "She's desperate, son, and scared. I've never seen eyes so frightened." The sheriff paused. "Your mother would have helped her." It was a low blow, and both men knew it. Martha Holcomb had been known throughout the territory for never turning away anyone in need before typhoid took her 3 years ago. Kirby's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," the sheriff agreed. "But it's true." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the snorting of horses and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Kirby sighed. "How long?" "Just until I can arrange something more permanent." 2 weeks, maybe 3. Kirby ran a hand through his dark hair. "Fine, but temporary, you understand. I can't have some terrified city girl disrupting my operation indefinitely." Relief washed over the sheriff's weathered face. "I'll bring her out tomorrow, and Kirby, thank you." After the sheriff rode away, Kirby stood in the doorway of his cabin, staring out at the darkening landscape. What had he just agreed to? His carefully ordered life was about to be invaded by a stranger, a woman with troubles he wanted no part of. He had enough of his own ghosts to contend with. The next day dawned clear and cool, typical for early June in Montana. Kirby rose before the sun, as was his habit, and went about his morning chores with grim determination. He mucked out the horse stalls, chopped extra firewood, and even gave the cabin a cursory cleaning, though he told himself it was simply because he preferred order, not because of the impending visitor. It was mid-afternoon when he spotted the sheriff's wagon approaching. Kirby was mending a fence on the far side of the corral, but set down his tools and walked slowly toward the cabin, trying to ignore the knot of apprehension in his stomach. The sheriff pulled up in front of the cabin, setting the brake on the wagon. Beside him sat a slight figure in a dusty blue dress, her face shadowed by a simple bonnet. "Kirby," the sheriff called in greeting, "I've brought Miss Turner." The young woman looked up then, and Kirby found himself momentarily frozen. She was lovely, despite the fading yellow-green bruise at her temple that makeup couldn't quite conceal. Her face was heart-shaped, with delicate features and full lips pressed into a nervous line. But it was her eyes that caught him, large and expressive, the color of summer violets, and filled with a wariness that made something twist inside his chest. He watched as she gathered a small carpetbag and allowed the sheriff to help her down from the wagon. Her hair, partially visible beneath the bonnet, was a rich chestnut brown, falling in loose waves past her shoulders. "Miss Turner, this is Kirby Holcomb," Sheriff Daniels said. "He's agreed to provide you shelter for a spell, as we discussed." She inclined her head slightly but didn't meet Kirby's eyes. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Holcomb. I won't be a burden." Her voice was soft but clear, with a refined quality that immediately marked her as educated. Not a ranch girl, that was certain. "You can call me Kirby," he said, more gruffly than he intended. "Everyone does." She nodded again but remained silent. An awkward pause followed before the sheriff cleared his throat. "Well, I'll just help bring in Miss Turner's things, and then I'll leave you folks to get acquainted." Things was a generous description for the carpetbag and one small trunk the sheriff unloaded from the wagon. The meager belongings of a woman who had fled in haste. After showing Tabitha to the small second bedroom that had once belonged to Kirby's parents, the sheriff took his leave, promising to check in within the week. As the sound of the wagon faded, Kirby was suddenly, acutely aware of being alone with this stranger who had invaded his solitude. "I've prepared a stew for supper," he said, gesturing toward the iron pot hanging over the low-burning fire. "Nothing fancy." "Thank you," she said. "I'd be happy to take over the cooking while I'm here. It's the least I can do." "If you want," he replied with a shrug. "Kitchen's there, provisions in the pantry." He pointed to a small adjoining room. "I usually eat at sundown." She nodded, clutching her hands together. Is there anything else I should know about the ranch or your expectations?" The hesitant way she asked made him wonder what expectations others had placed on her before. "I start work at dawn," he said, deliberately keeping his tone neutral. "I'm out most of the day with the cattle or fixing things around the place. I keep to myself and expect you'll do the same." "The sheriff says you're in some kind of trouble, and that's your business. I don't need to know details, just don't bring trouble to my door." Something that might have been relief flickered across her face. "I understand." "Thank you." That first evening passed in awkward silence, with Tabitha picking at her food and Kirby pretending not to notice how she startled at every unexpected sound. After supper, he retreated to the porch with his pipe while she washed the dishes. Through the window, he could see her moving efficiently around his kitchen, her movements precise and practiced. She had the grace of someone who knew her way around a household, despite her obvious genteel background. Later, as he lay in his bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving in his home, Kirby wondered what he had gotten himself into. He'd lived alone for so long that even the soft creak of floorboards under her light step felt like an intrusion. Worse, he couldn't shake the image of those violet eyes, filled with shadows that had nothing to do with the fading light. The first week established a wary routine. Tabitha rose early, though never as early as Kirby, and had coffee brewing by the time he came in from his dawn check of the cattle. She kept the cabin spotless, prepared simple but satisfying meals, and stayed out of his way. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and never mentioned her past or the circumstances that had brought her to his door. But Kirby wasn't blind. He saw how she tensed whenever hoofbeats approached the ranch, how she would position herself near doors as if calculating escape routes, how she would sometimes stop whatever she was doing and simply stand motionless, eyes closed, breathing deliberately as though fighting some internal battle. It bothered him more than it should have. He told himself it was merely annoyance at having his routine disrupted, at having to be mindful of a stranger in his space. But the truth was, her fear stirred something in him he'd thought long buried, a protective instinct that had no place in the life he'd built for himself. On the 8th day, as a summer storm rolled across the plains, Kirby returned to the cabin earlier than usual, soaked through and chilled. He found Tabitha at the kitchen table, mending one of his shirts with tiny, perfect stitches. She looked up, startled by his sudden entrance. "You're back early," she observed, setting aside her sewing. "You must be freezing. I'll put water on for coffee." "Thanks," he said, removing his dripping hat and coat. "Storm came on faster than I expected." As she moved to the stove, he noticed for the first time that she had arranged wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, prairie daisies and purple coneflowers that added an unexpected touch of beauty to his utilitarian home. It was such a small thing, but somehow it underscored how long it had been since anyone had tried to make this place more than just a shelter. "I hope you don't mind," she said, following his gaze to the flowers. "I gathered them yesterday near the creek." "No," he said, surprised by the softness in his own voice. "They're nice." A small smile curved her lips, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and something shifted in the air between them. For a moment, she wasn't just a burden he'd reluctantly taken on, but a woman who found joy in simple beauty despite whatever darkness she carried. The storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the plains. Kirby sat at the table, warming his hands around the coffee mug she had placed before him. "Looks like I won't get much more done today," he said. "Perhaps you could rest," she suggested. "You work from sunrise to sunset every day." He shrugged. "That's ranch life." "Even so, everyone needs rest sometimes." She hesitated, then added quietly, "My father used to say that a mind needs fallow time just like a field." It was the first personal detail she'd shared. Kirby found himself curious despite his determination to maintain distance. "Your father was a farmer." She shook her head, a professor of literature at a small college in Pennsylvania. But he loved gardening and was forever making metaphors between nature and human experience. "And what brought you west from Pennsylvania?" he asked, immediately regretting the question when he saw her expression close off. "I'm sorry," he added quickly, "that's not my business." Tabitha stared into her coffee cup. "No, it's all right. I married. My husband had business opportunities in Kansas City." Her voice had taken on a flat quality. "It didn't work out as I had hoped." The understatement hung in the air between them, as loud as the thunder outside. "Is he the one you're running from?" Kirby asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. Her fingers tightened around her cup. "Yes." She offered nothing more, and Kirby didn't press. But that single admission changed something. The bruise at her temple had faded, but he could now see the deeper wounds she carried, wounds inflicted by someone who had vowed to cherish her. The storm continued into the evening, forcing them into prolonged proximity. After supper, rather than retreat to his bedroom as he usually did, Kirby found himself lingering by the fire, watching as Tabitha pulled out a small book from her carpetbag. "What are you reading?" he asked. She held up the volume. "Tennyson. It was a gift from my father." Kirby nodded, though poetry had never been of much interest to him. Would you read some?" The request surprised them both. But something about the storm, the isolation, and the unexpected intimacy of sharing confidences had lowered barriers he hadn't even realized he'd built. Tabitha hesitated only briefly before opening the book. Her voice, when she began to read, was like nothing Kirby had heard before, melodic and expressive, bringing the words to life in the flickering firelight. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all," she finished softly, closing the book. "You believe that?" Kirby asked. She considered the question. "I used to, now I'm not certain." "I'm not sure I ever believed it," he admitted. "Seems to me loving just gives people power to hurt you." Their eyes met across the small space, mutual understanding passing between them. They were both wounded souls, he realized, though in different ways. He had chosen isolation to protect himself. She had been forced into it by betrayal. "Why did you agree to take me in?" Tabitha asked suddenly. "Sheriff Daniels said you live alone by choice." Kirby stared into the fire. "My mother would have done it," he said finally. "She never turned away anyone who needed help." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was. Died 3 years ago, typhoid." "I'm sorry," Tabitha said softly. "My mother died when I was 12. It leaves a hole nothing quite fills, doesn't it?" Kirby nodded, struck by how easily she had articulated what he had felt for years. "My father followed 6 months later. Just lost the will to go on, I think. They were devoted to each other." "That's rare," Tabitha murmured, "and beautiful." "It is," Kirby agreed, "but it's also why I knew I'd never marry. I saw what losing her did to my father. I don't want to be that vulnerable." As soon as the words left his mouth, he regretted them. What a thing to say to a woman whose marriage had clearly been nothing but pain, but Tabitha didn't seem offended. "I understand," she said. "After my experience, I can't imagine trusting anyone like that again either." The frank admission created a strange sense of kinship between them, two people who had seen the damage love could do and chose safety instead. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed the world clean. Kirby rose at his usual hour, but instead of heading straight out, he found himself lingering over the coffee Tabitha prepared. Their conversation flowed more easily now, the shared confidences of the previous evening having broken some invisible barrier. As the days passed, Kirby found himself returning to the cabin earlier, making excuses to be around when Tabitha might share another poem or tell stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania. She in turn seemed to relax in his presence, her smiles coming more frequently and her violet eyes losing some of their haunted quality. He learned that she was accomplished on the piano, had a gift for languages, and could name every constellation in the night sky, all evidence of the educated upbringing she'd had. She learned that beneath his gruff exterior, Kirby had a dry wit, a surprising knowledge of native plants and their uses, and a gentle hand with injured animals. 2 weeks stretched into 3, then 4, with no word from Sheriff Daniels about alternative arrangements. Kirby found himself in no hurry to remind him. The truth was, he had grown accustomed to Tabitha's presence. More than accustomed, he had come to value it. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tabitha broke a comfortable silence. "I should leave soon," she said quietly. "I've imposed on your hospitality far longer than intended." Kirby turned to look at her, surprised by how strongly he rejected the idea. "There's no need," he said. "The arrangement is working well enough. Even so, I can't hide forever, and it's not fair to you, having to accommodate a stranger indefinitely." "You're hardly a stranger anymore, Tabitha." She smiled at that, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth," he insisted, "and the fact is, the ranch runs better with you here. The cabin's never been so clean, the meals never so good." "Is that all I am? A convenient housekeeper?" The question was posed lightly, but he heard the real query beneath it. "No," he admitted after a pause, "that's not all." He didn't elaborate, couldn't find the words to express how her presence had slowly filled an emptiness he'd denied for years. How he found himself looking forward to the end of each day, when he could return to the warmth of the cabin and the sound of her voice. How the ranch had begun to feel like a home again, rather than just a place he worked. Tabitha studied his face in the fading light. "What are you afraid of, Kirby?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I'm not afraid." "Aren't you? You've built walls around yourself so high that even you can't see over them anymore." Her words struck uncomfortably close to truth. "And you haven't," he countered. "You're hiding too, Tabitha, and not just from your husband." She flinched slightly but didn't deny it. "Perhaps we're more alike than we first appeared." The next morning, Kirby rode into town for supplies and to check for mail. It was a task he usually undertook every few weeks, but had postponed longer than usual, reluctant to leave Tabitha alone for an entire day. But they were running low on flour and coffee, and he needed to order fence posts for repairs on the north boundary. Main Street was busier than usual, with a cattle drive having stopped on its way north to Montana. Cowboys filled the saloon, and wagons lined the street in front of the general store. Kirby tied his horse at the hitching post and made his way inside, nodding greetings to people he knew. He was selecting supplies when he overheard a conversation between the storekeeper and a well-dressed stranger. "Looking for my wife," the man was saying, sliding a photograph across the counter. "She may have passed through here about a month ago. Name's Tabitha Howard, though she might be using her maiden name, Turner." Kirby froze, a sack of flour in his hands. The stranger's voice was cultured, his clothes expensive. He looked every inch the successful businessman, not the monster Kirby had imagined. "Can't say I recall anyone by that name," the storekeeper said, studying the photograph. "But I don't see everyone who comes through. Sheriff might know." "I'll speak with him next," the man Howard said smoothly. "My wife is unwell, had some unfortunate delusions about our marriage and ran off. I'm naturally concerned for her safety." The storekeeper made sympathetic noises. "Terrible thing, hope you find her soon." "As do I. There's a reward for information leading to her whereabouts." "A substantial one." Kirby set down the flour and walked out of the store without completing his purchases, his mind racing. He needed to get back to the ranch, to warn Tabitha. As he untied his horse, he caught sight of Sheriff Daniels approaching from the direction of his office. "Kirby," the older man greeted him. "Good timing, I was about to ride out to see you." "Sheriff," Kirby acknowledged tensely. "Her husband's in town." The sheriff's expression turned grim. "I know, just met him. Smooth-talking fellow, isn't he? Makes it hard to believe the things Miss Turner told me after you left that first day." "What things?" Kirby demanded. The sheriff glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. That he beat her regularly, that the last time he nearly killed her, that he threatened to finish the job if she ever tried to leave again. He sighed heavily. "Said he's got friends in high places back in Kansas City. Police, judges, no one would help her." Cold fury washed through Kirby, and now he's here. "He is, claims she's mentally unstable, prone to making up stories. Says he just wants to help her." "You don't believe that?" "No," Sheriff Daniels said firmly, "but I'm just one sheriff in a small Montana town. He's got money and influence." He lowered his voice further. "I stalled him, told him I'd need to consult my records before I could help. That should buy you a few hours at most." "To do what?" "To get her out of here," the sheriff said grimly, "far away from that snake. I've seen his kind before, Kirby, all charm in public, all cruelty in private." Kirby's mind was already racing ahead. The Northern Pacific Line, if we can get her to the station at Fort Benton, she could be in Canada before he knows she's gone. The sheriff nodded. "Good thinking. I can't officially help, would be my badge if anyone found out I aided a wife fleeing her husband, but unofficially." He pressed a small pouch into Kirby's hand. "Enough for a ticket and some supplies." "I can't take your money, Sheriff." "It's not mine," the older man said with a wry smile. "It's the fine money that scoundrel Jenkins paid last month after that brawl in the saloon. Never got around to logging it officially. Consider it justice being served." Kirby pocketed the money with a nod of thanks. "I need to get back." "Go," the sheriff urged, "and Kirby, be careful. Men like Howard don't let go of what they consider their property, and they don't fight fair." The ride back to the ranch was the fastest Kirby had ever made, pushing his horse to its limits. All he could think about was Tabitha alone at the cabin, unaware that her worst nightmare had tracked her to their small Montana town. Their cabin, when had he started thinking of them that way? When had the solitary life he'd built begun to include her so fundamentally? He arrived to find Tabitha hanging laundry in the yard, her chestnut hair gleaming in the midday sun. The simple domesticity of the scene, his shirts flapping beside her dresses on the line, struck him with unexpected force. This was what he stood to lose. "Kirby," she called, shielding her eyes against the sun as he dismounted. "You're back early. Is everything all right?" "Pack your things," he said without preamble. "Only what you can carry, we need to leave." The color drained from her face. "He's found me." It wasn't a question, but Kirby nodded anyway. "He's in town. Asking questions, showing your picture." Tabitha's hands trembled as she unpinned a shirt from the line. "How? I was so careful. I changed my name, took the stage under a false identity." "It doesn't matter now," Kirby said, taking her gently by the shoulders. What matters is getting you to safety. The sheriff is stalling him, but it won't last long. She looked up at him, those violet eyes wide with fear but also determination. I won't bring danger to your door, Kirby. I'll go alone. No, he said firmly, we go together. But your ranch will still be here when this is over. She shook her head. You don't understand. Edmund won't stop. He'll never stop until he finds me. Or until. Until what? Until one of us is dead, she whispered. The starkness of her words chilled him. Then we'll make sure it isn't you, he said grimly. Go pack, I'll saddle the horses. Within 20 minutes they were mounted and heading north, away from town, and toward the distant railroad that could carry Tabitha to freedom across the Canadian border. Kirby had packed provisions for several days, unsure how long it would take to reach Fort Benton and the Northern Pacific Line. They rode hard until dusk, saying little, both lost in their own thoughts. When they finally stopped to make camp in a sheltered ravine, Tabitha looked exhausted, the strain of the day etched in the tight lines around her mouth. As they sat by a small fire, eating a cold supper of jerky and hard biscuits, she finally broke her silence. I met Edmund at a literary society meeting, she said quietly. He was charming, educated, seemingly everything I had been raised to value. He courted me properly, won over my father with discussions of philosophy and art. A bitter smile crossed her face. I thought myself so fortunate. Kirby listened silently, understanding that she needed to unburden herself of this story she had carried alone for too long. The change came after the wedding, she continued. Small things at first. Criticisms of my appearance, my housekeeping, then controlling who I could see, where I could go, then the first blow. Her voice faltered. I told myself it was an aberration, that he was under strain from his business dealings. I made excuses. It wasn't your fault, Kirby said firmly. I know that now, but then, I believed him when he said I had provoked him, that I wasn't being a proper wife. She stared into the fire. The beatings got worse. The last one, I thought he would kill me. There was such rage in his eyes. Kirby's hands clenched into fists. How did you get away? Our housekeeper helped me, slipped me money she had saved, helped me plan. Edmund was away on business for 3 days. It was my only chance. She looked up at Kirby, her eyes reflecting the firelight. I've been running ever since, until your ranch, until... Until what? He prompted when she fell silent. Until I started to feel safe again, she admitted softly, with you. The simple declaration pierced him more deeply than any eloquent speech could have. He moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. You are safe with me, he promised. I won't let him hurt you again. She leaned slightly against him, the contact sending warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire. Why are you doing this, Kirby, risking everything for someone you barely know? He considered the question, searching for the truth beneath his own defenses. Because I do know you, he said finally. Maybe better than I've known anyone in a long time, and because, he hesitated, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, because I care what happens to you, more than I should, probably. She turned to look at him then, her face inches from his. I care about you too, she whispered, more than is wise for a woman in my position. The confession hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither was ready to fully acknowledge. But it changed something fundamental, giving name to the connection that had been growing between them since that first day. They slept that night under the vast Montana sky, close but not touching, each aware of the other in a way that transcended physical proximity. Morning brought renewed urgency as they continued their journey north. By Kirby's estimation, they were still at least 2 days from Fort Benton, assuming they kept to lesser-used trails to avoid detection. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a stream. As Tabitha knelt to fill their canteens, Kirby scanned the horizon, a habit born of years on the frontier. A faint dust cloud in the distance caught his attention. Riders, he said tersely, coming fast. Tabitha's head snapped up, fear flooding her expression. Edmund. Can't tell yet, but we need to move. He helped her to her feet, his mind racing through options. There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles east. We might find shelter there. They mounted quickly and set off at a gallop, leaving the main trail for rougher terrain where they might lose pursuers among the rolling hills. Kirby led them through a maze of gullies and draws, hoping to use the landscape to their advantage. but the riders behind them were gaining. As they crested a rise, Kirby glanced back and could now make out 4 men on horseback, moving with the determination of hunters who had spotted their prey. "It's him, isn't it?" Tabitha asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Looks like it," Kirby confirmed grimly, "and he's brought help." They pushed their tired horses harder, but Kirby knew they couldn't outrun the fresh mounts behind them indefinitely. His mind turned to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He was a good shot, had to be to protect his cattle from wolves and other predators, but shooting at men was different. Yet as he glanced at Tabitha's pale face, he knew he would do whatever was necessary to protect her. The trapper's cabin came into view as they rounded a bend, a small, rough structure nestled against a rocky hillside. It wasn't much, but its stone walls would provide better protection than open ground. "There," he pointed. "We'll make our stand there." They dismounted quickly, Kirby helping Tabitha down before retrieving his rifle and ammunition from his saddlebags. "Get inside," he instructed, leading both horses to the back of the cabin where they would be sheltered from gunfire. The interior of the cabin was dusty and abandoned, with a simple stone fireplace, a crude table, and remnants of a bed frame. Kirby positioned himself at one of the 2 small windows, rifle ready. "Stay back from the windows," he told Tabitha, who stood in the center of the small space, her hands clasped tightly together. "This is my fight too," she said with unexpected firmness. "Do you have another weapon?" Kirby hesitated, then pulled his revolver from his holster and handed it to her. "You know how to use this." "My father taught me," she said, checking the chambers with practiced ease that surprised him. He believed all women should know how to defend themselves. "Wise man," Kirby said with a grim smile. The approaching riders had slowed, evidently having spotted the cabin and recognizing the tactical disadvantage they now faced. They stopped just beyond effective rifle range, 4 figures silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "Tabitha," a voice called out, cultured and controlled. "I know you're in there, my dear. This charade has gone on long enough." She flinched at the sound but moved to stand beside Kirby at the window. "That's Edmund," she whispered. Kirby studied the man who had caused Tabitha such pain. Even at this distance, he could see the fine cut of his clothes, the confident posture of a man accustomed to having his way. Hatred, pure and sharp, coursed through him. "Come out now and I'll be lenient," Edmund called. "Continue this foolishness and I promise you'll regret it, you and whoever is harboring you." "What do we do?" Tabitha asked, her voice barely audible. Kirby considered their options. They were outnumbered but had the advantage of shelter. If they could hold out until nightfall, they might be able to slip away in the darkness. "We wait," he said. "They won't risk a frontal assault on a defended position." But even as he spoke, 2 of the riders dismounted and began moving to flank the cabin, using the rolling terrain for cover. "I don't think waiting is an option," Tabitha observed tensely. Kirby raised his rifle and fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt near one of the flanking men. The man dove for cover, but the message was clear. "They wouldn't be taken without a fight. That was your only warning," Kirby shouted. "Next shot won't miss." For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then Edmund's voice rang out again, now with an edge of anger beneath the cultivated tones. "You're outmatched, whoever you are. I have no quarrel with you, just give me my wife and you can go free." "She's not yours to claim anymore," Kirby called back. Edmund's laugh was cold and cutting. "She's my legal wife. The law is on my side, friend." "Not out here it isn't," Kirby replied. "Out here a woman gets to choose who she belongs to." Beside him, Tabitha straightened, something like hope flickering in her eyes. "He won't give up," she warned. "He can't bear to lose what he considers his property." "Then he'll have to learn," Kirby said grimly. The standoff continued as the sun began its westward descent. Occasionally, one of Edmund's men would test their vigilance with a move toward the cabin, only to be driven back by Kirby's accurate rifle fire. But as shadows lengthened, Kirby knew they were running out of options. Their horses were exhausted, they had limited ammunition, and eventually Edmund would grow desperate enough to risk a direct assault. As if reading his thoughts, movement from the east drew his attention. More riders, Kirby's heart sank. Reinforcements for Edmund would shift the odds decisively against them. But as the newcomers drew closer, Kirby recognized the lead rider's silhouette. "Sheriff Daniels," he breathed in relief. Tabitha moved to look out the window. How? I don't know, but I'm not questioning our good fortune. The sheriff and his 3 deputies approached from behind Edmund's position, catching the 4 men in potential crossfire. Howard, Sheriff Daniels called out, "This ends now, you and your men drop your weapons." Edmund turned, clearly surprised by the sheriff's arrival. "This is a private matter, Sheriff." A husband retrieving his runaway wife. "Not in my jurisdiction, it isn't," the sheriff replied firmly. "I've got sworn statements from 3 different women about your private matters, Howard, including a doctor's report on your wife's injuries." Kirby glanced at Tabitha, whose face showed a mixture of shock and vindication. "The housekeeper," she whispered, "she must have gone to the authorities after I left." "And I've got telegrams from the Kansas City police," the sheriff continued, "who are mighty interested in speaking with you about some financial irregularities at your company. Seems you've been misappropriating funds." Edmund's composed facade cracked visibly. "Those are baseless accusations." "Maybe so, but you'll answer for them in a court of law, not out here with guns against a defenseless woman." For a moment it seemed Edmund might surrender. Then, with startling speed, he drew a hidden pistol and fired at the sheriff. The shot went wide, but it broke the tense standoff into chaotic action. Gunfire erupted as Edmund and his men exchanged shots with the sheriff's deputies. Kirby pulled Tabitha down below the window as bullets splintered the wooden frame above them. "Stay down," he ordered, returning fire through the window. The gunfight was brief but intense. When it ended, 2 of Edmund's men lay wounded on the ground. The 3rd had surrendered, and Edmund Howard himself was pinned beneath his fallen horse, his elegant clothes now stained with dust and blood from what appeared to be a wound in his shoulder. Sheriff Daniels approached the cabin cautiously. "Kirby, Miss Turner, you folks all right in there?" "We're unharmed," Kirby called back, helping Tabitha to her feet. They emerged from the cabin into the fading daylight. Tabitha's eyes immediately found her husband, now being hauled roughly to his feet by one of the deputies. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the distance, the man who had tried to destroy her and the woman who had found the courage to escape. "You're nothing without me," Edmund spat, his cultured veneer stripped away by pain and defeat. "Nothing." Tabitha straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and spoke with quiet dignity that carried across the space between them. "I am everything without you, Edmund, everything I was meant to be." She turned away from him then, deliberately presenting her back, the ultimate dismissal. Edmund lunged forward with a snarl, only to be restrained by the deputies. Sheriff Daniels approached them, his weathered face showing relief and concern. "You 2 gave me a scare, heading north like that. Took some tracking to find you." "How did you know to follow?" Kirby asked. The sheriff's eyes crinkled. "Let's just say I know this territory better than most, and I figured you'd head for the railroad." He glanced at the prisoners being secured by his deputies. "Howard won't trouble you anymore, Miss Turner. He'll face charges in Kansas City, both for his financial crimes and for what he did to you." "Will my testimony be needed?" she asked, fear momentarily returning to her eyes. "The doctor's report and the statements from your housekeeper and others should be sufficient," the sheriff assured her. "But if it comes to it, I'd go with you to ensure your safety." "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he turned to Kirby. "We'll escort these men to jail. You 2 should rest here tonight and head back to the ranch tomorrow. Your horses look done in." After the sheriff and his deputies departed with their prisoners, Kirby and Tabitha stood in the gathering dusk, the reality of what had happened, and what had almost happened, settling over them like a physical weight. "It's over," Tabitha said, wonder in her voice. "Truly over." Kirby nodded, suddenly awkward now that the immediate danger had passed. "You're free to go wherever you want now. Start a new life." She turned to him, her violet eyes searching his face. "And if where I want to go is back to your ranch?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Kirby had spent years convincing himself that isolation was safer, that emotional connections were dangerous vulnerabilities. But the thought of returning to his empty cabin, of mornings without her smile or evenings without her voice, felt like a wound opening inside him. "It's a hard life," he said quietly. "Lonely sometimes. Not much compared to what you're used to." "It wasn't lonely when I was there," she replied simply, and it had everything that matters. She stepped closer to him. Unless you want me to leave. No, he said, the word escaping before he could second-guess it. I don't want you to leave. He reached out hesitantly, his calloused hand finding hers. Their fingers intertwined with a rightness that startled him. I thought I knew what I wanted, he admitted. A quiet life, no complications, but then you came and everything changed. You changed everything, Tabitha. You changed everything for me too, she whispered. You showed me what safety feels like, what respect feels like. Her free hand came up to touch his cheek gently. What love could feel like. The word hung in the air between them, both frightening and exhilarating. Kirby had run from it for years, believing it a weakness. Tabitha had seen it twisted into something cruel. Yet here it was, tentative but undeniable, growing between two wounded souls who had found unexpected healing in each other. Kirby pulled her closer, his arms encircling her with a gentleness that belied his strength. I don't know how to do this, he confessed, how to be what you need. She smiled up at him, and for the first time he saw no shadows in her violet eyes. You already are what I need, Kirby Holcomb. Just as you are. When he kissed her, it was like coming home to a place he hadn't known he was searching for, tender, affirming, and filled with promise. That night they slept beneath the same worn blanket in the trapper's cabin, her head resting on his chest, his arms keeping her safe. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. The journey back to the ranch the next day had a different quality, no longer a flight from danger, but a return to something they now recognized as home. The familiar silhouette of Kirby's cabin against the Montana sky stirred emotions in both of them that would have been unimaginable months before. Life settled into new rhythms as summer gave way to autumn. Tabitha received official word that Edmund had been convicted of financial crimes and would serve several years in prison. The charges of abuse had been considered in his sentencing, though never brought as separate counts, a common reality for women in their time, but it was enough to know that she was truly free. With that freedom came choices. Tabitha could have gone anywhere, started any life she wished. But she chose to stay, helping Kirby expand the garden, teaching him about the books she loved, bringing music and laughter to rooms that had known only silence for too long. And Kirby found himself changing too, opening up, sharing stories of his parents, making plans that included someone else. The ranch prospered under their joint care, becoming not just a place of work but a true home. On a crisp October morning, with golden aspen leaves drifting in the breeze, Kirby took Tabitha's hand as they stood on the porch of their cabin. I have something to ask you, he said, uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. Something I never thought I'd ask anyone. Tabitha's heart quickened as he knelt before her, his strong, work-roughened hands holding hers with infinite tenderness. I know you've had reason to distrust marriage, he said carefully. And I'd understand if you never wanted to enter into it again. But I want you to know that if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife, I would spend every day making sure you never regretted it. Tears welled in Tabitha's violet eyes. Are you certain? You once told me you never wanted to be that vulnerable. I've learned something important, he said, looking up at her with a smile that transformed his handsome face. Being vulnerable with the right person isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength I've ever known. She pulled him to his feet, her hands framing his face. Then yes, Kirby Holcomb, yes, I will marry you. They were wed 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Sheriff Daniels giving the bride away and the whole community turning out to celebrate. The woman who had arrived frightened and alone now stood radiant in a simple ivory dress, wildflowers in her chestnut hair, as she promised herself to a man who had learned that love wasn't a vulnerability but a source of courage. And Kirby, who had once believed that the frontier was no place for sentiment, discovered that love was precisely what the harsh land needed, that sharing burdens made them lighter, and sharing joys made them sweeter. Years later, on that same porch where he had proposed, Kirby would sit with Tabitha watching their children play in the yard of a ranch that had grown prosperous under their care. And he would think about how a man who had opened his home to a woman living in fear had, in doing so, opened his heart to a happiness he had never believed possible. The Montana sky would stretch endless above them, but no longer empty, for they had filled their corner of the vast frontier with the one thing stronger than its harshness, a love built on respect, trust, and the courage to be vulnerable in a land that forgave no weakness. They had found in each other not just shelter from storms, but a reason to weather them together, and in doing so had transformed a solitary existence into a life richly lived, proving that even in the wild heart of the frontier, love could not just survive but flourish.